of the Honourable Craig Foss is moving us very well and positively in that direction, and I commend this bill to the House.
Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak in the second reading of this bill, the Commerce Commission International Cooperation and Fees Bill, and I'd like to make some comments on the importance of this bill and what was sought to achieve in the Select Committee, on which there was a number of considerations following the submitters that appeared before us. And then I'd like to make some comments taking up from the previous speaker on the importance of harmonisation, and I would like to make the point up front that that the way I see it, that this government actually pursues harmonisation with our closest geographical neighbour across the ditch when it suits them, on very light-handed legislation, and not on other issues that are probably of equal importance to New Zealand's economic situation and its future, particularly in fostering innovation within its own environment and competition. But first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge, as I think previous speakers have, that this bill was introduced initially by the Honourable Leanne Dalzell, and it's important to acknowledge that it was adopted by Simon Power and now by the new Minister Craig Foss, and the Select Committee that heard it, I think it was nearly 2 years ago, was actually chaired by Leanne Dalzell, and very well chaired, and it's good that we have a new chair in place now who seems to be doing a very good job. The Commerce Committee actually is a sensible committee and treats every piece of legislation that comes before it very seriously and takes into account the views of the submitters. And while this bill aligns us with Australia, there were some quite serious issues raised during the discussion on it, which I just want to briefly touch on. There were some important submitters that came before it, and namely the Meat Industry Association, Meridian Energy, Vodafone and Telecom, which pointed out some, as they saw it, some significant issues in terms of the risks of having information being provided one way but not necessarily coming across the other way, and the risks for those organisations of feeling vulnerable in that situation and possibly being opened up to adverse circumstances. And the committee took that very seriously, and while you'll see that there is a supplementary order paper being put before the House on addressing the anomaly of the importance of including the Telecommunications Act under the ambit of this bill, the Select Committee also recommended that there should be a consultative procedure where the Commerce Commission was concerned that where it had concerns that any request for assistance might have significant international trade implications that might adversely affect on organisations within New Zealand, and in those cases that the Commission may consult the Minister of Trade after consultation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and then rely on a statement by the Minister of Trade as to whether providing that information or assistance would significantly prejudice New Zealand's international trade interests. And I think that was probably the most significant thing that came out of discussions in the Select Committee, because we certainly didn't want, while we were committed to the harmonisation principle, we certainly did not want to see companies that trade and are active in New Zealand feeling disadvantaged by such a piece of legislation. So the Commission has to be satisfied that any information provided to comparable regulators overseas would not significantly prejudice New Zealand's international trade interests. So that was seen as being pretty important, and I think it's important to acknowledge the good work that the committee did on this. I'd like to turn though to consideration of the harmonisation principle, because, you know, I've heard previous speaker across the House talking about the importance of cooperating across the Tasman, and I would certainly concur with that. Certainly, particularly where we can have an advantageous arrangement and relationship with our Australian cousins. But the most important thing to acknowledge is that there's an awful lot of legislation, and there's an awful lot in our current regulatory environment where there is clearly not harmonisation, and instead we're seriously out of step, and I would contend got our heads buried in the sand on a number of issues. And I actually want to mention some of them, because with regards to this particular bill, which is based on a principle of harmonisation, that's pretty important. Particularly around taking us into the 21st century and ensuring that we've got a competitive environment that truly fosters innovation with new technologies, and there are some serious examples. First of all, let's look at this government's refusal to countenance a converged regulatory environment for the telecommunications and broadcasting environments. We've currently got two ministers across the House. We've got regulation for the telecommunications sector, but no regulation in the broadcasting sector. And instead, we've got an absolute refusal to acknowledge the clamour for change that's coming right from across industry, from concern from the public, and a number of other places. And when you look at particularly how this is affecting new technology platforms, where their success depends on companies, for instance, in the broadcasting sphere, having access to premium content with the take-up of ultra-fast broadband, currently most of the rights to this content in New Zealand are held by a very small number of market participants. And instead, what we see from the current Minister of Communications and IT, and from the Broadcasting Minister, who happens to also be the Commerce Minister with carriage of this particular bill, which is concerned with the principle of harmonisation, we see an absolute refusal to acknowledge that there needs to be any change. Whereas across the ditch in Australia, we see a converged regulator, we see regulation for content, and we see a serious acknowledgement of the importance to embrace change. And in fact, right this very moment, in the last couple of days, there's been a new review come out, which was driven by the minister over there, the converged minister, on convergence, which is a huge step forward. Of course, it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be a lot of public debate and discussion around it, but at least they're having that public debate and discussion, whereas here, this government is actually trying to squash it and pretend it doesn't exist. The Convergent Review's final report was released on Monday, and its task was to develop a framework where all media communications could be regulated equally, regardless of whether it was distributed by radio, television or internet. Now, if we wanted to take harmonisation seriously, that's where we would be looking. We would be looking at ensuring that a similar review was undertaken here, that we were addressing these issues, that we were taking them seriously, and that we weren't burying our heads in the sand. And you've got to ask yourself why we are burying our heads in the sand, because essentially we won't go near these issues, and the reason is, Mr. Speaker, I put to you, is that's because there's too many vested interests involved. There's too many vested interests involved with too much power by too few organisations that can disproportionately influence government policy. And with regard to the harmonisation and principles within this bill, which is being debated today, upon which there is agreement across the House, it would be good to see some agreement across the House on some other issues. And the lobbying bill, I'd just like to mention the lobbying bill, which is being put forward by the Greens and which is certainly supported by Labor and a number of parties across the House who see that it's actually going to drive some important change and put the spotlight on the organisations that have disproportionate access to ministers who are making decisions, important decisions around policy and legislation. and where it may actually start to reduce the cronyism and deal-doing which has dogged this government's behaviour in the last 3.5 years. Because, Mr Speaker, I'd put to you that while politics is certainly about influence, and influence is important, it should also be about conscience and ethics. And it's a sad fact that under this government we're seeing very little of that. So just returning to this bill which is before us today, Labor certainly supports it. We support the values behind harmonisation, and we would like to see harmonisation occurring on other issues such as convergence of broadcasting and telecommunications.
David Clendon.
Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to stand